My sister and my parents dragged me and my 78-year-old grandfather into the freezing basement of our family estate on Christmas night and locked the heavy steel door. As I panicked trying to find a way out, my grandfather simply smiled, touched his finger to his lips, and whispered that they had no idea what was hidden behind the concrete wall. When he pulled away a loose brick, he revealed a secret that completely destroyed my parents' perfect lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect the only person in your family who truly loved you. The air in the formal dining room of my parents' sprawling Atlanta estate was thick with the scent of roasted duck and expensive pine candles, but all I could smell was pure greed. I am Keisha, 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the designated disappointment in my family. That night, the tension that had been brewing for decades finally boiled over into outright violence. It started right after dessert. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the mahogany table, but the mood was ice cold. Preston, my 32-year-old white brother-in-law, stood looming over my grandfather Silas. Preston wore a custom-tailored suit paid for by my parents' money and carried himself with that specific type of unearned arrogance that made my blood boil. Preston slammed a heavy gold Mont Blanc pen onto the polished wood right in front of Grandpa Silas. The loud crack made the crystal wine glasses rattle. "Sign the deed," Silas Preston demanded, his voice laced with a sickly sweet corporate condescension. "It is just a simple transfer of assets. My startup needs an emergency liquidity injection to scale our operations for the next quarter. You are sitting on prime real estate that is doing nothing but gathering dust. We need to leverage the ancestral property to save the company. It is a win for the whole family." I watched Grandpa Silas stare down at the gold pen. His weathered hands, which had built this family from absolute nothing, trembled slightly against the white tablecloth. He was 78 years old, a man who had survived unimaginable hardships to acquire his land. And here was this smug, entitled tech bro talking to him like he was a confused child. Silas did not reach for the pen. He simply sat there, maintaining his quiet dignity, while Preston sighed loudly as if he were the one being inconvenienced. "Listen to me," Silas Preston continued, leaning closer and placing both hands flat on the table. "You are getting older. You do not understand how modern venture capital works. We are pivoting to a subscription-based synergy model, but the angel investors pulled out because they lack vision. If I do not show proof of capital by the end of the fiscal year, the app goes under. Vernon and Beatrice have already tapped out their liquid assets. This house is the only viable collateral left. Do the right thing for your legacy." I could not take it for another second. The sheer audacity of this man coming into a black household, relying entirely on his white privilege and corporate jargon to swindle an elderly man out of his generational wealth, made me see red. I stood up so fast my chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. I marched around the table, stepping right between Preston and my grandfather. I snatched the gold pen off the mahogany wood, turned around, and threw it straight into the roaring fireplace. "You do not get to bully the man who built this family just to fund your delusions, Preston," I snapped, my voice vibrating with absolute rage. "You are not getting a single square inch of his property." The silence that followed was deafening. Preston stared at the fireplace where his expensive pen was melting into the embers, his jaw tight with anger. But it was not Preston who broke the silence. It was my mother. Beatrice slammed her hands down on the table, sending her silverware clattering. "Keisha, you ungrateful little witch!" she shrieked, her face contorted with fury. "How dare you ruin our Christmas dinner? Preston is a brilliant man with an incredible business mind. He is trying to elevate this family to the next tier of wealth, and you are standing in the way because you are bitter." My mother had always worshipped proximity to status. To her, having a white son-in-law who threw around words like synergy and venture capital was the ultimate country club prize. She completely ignored the fact that he was financially bleeding them dry. "You are just a bitter 32-year-old single woman," Beatrice continued, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You have no husband, no prospects, and you spend all day staring at computer screens in a dark room. Do not project your miserable, lonely life onto your brother-in-law." My sister Chantel, who was 30 and wearing a designer gown that cost more than my first car, chimed in right on cue. Mom is right, Keisha Chantel sneered, swirling her champagne. You are just mad that Dad gave Preston the $100,000 from the family trust, instead of wasting it on your little computer repair hobby. You fix routers for a living. Preston is a visionary. I let out a harsh laugh. I looked at Chantel and then at her husband. A visionary, I repeated, staring Preston down. Your visionary husband has not generated a single dime of revenue in 3 years. His innovative app is a joke in the industry. He has been burning through Mom and Dad's retirement savings to fund his expensive lunches and fake investor meetings. The only thing he is scaling is his debt. Preston scoffed, adjusting his cuffs with a smug smile. That is exactly why you are stuck at the bottom of the corporate ladder, Keisha. You have a narrow, small-minded view of commerce. It takes money to make money. We are establishing a superior market strategy. You simply do not understand real business. You are right, I do not understand the business of stealing from senior citizens, I fired back. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, my fingers flying across the screen. I am done listening to this nonsense. If you do not back away from Grandpa Silas right now, I am calling the Atlanta police and reporting you both for elder financial abuse and coercion. The moment the word police left my mouth, the atmosphere in the room completely shattered. My father, Vernon, who had been sitting quietly at the head of the table sipping his scotch, suddenly erupted. He had always been obsessed with appearances, terrified of any scandal that might jeopardize his standing with his wealthy friends. You will do no such thing, Vernon roared. He lunged across the table, knocking over glasses and plates, and snatched the phone right out of my hand. He threw it fiercely against the stone hearth, shattering the screen into a dozen pieces. You are not bringing cops to my house and ruining my reputation, you ungrateful brat. Before I could even process the destruction of my phone, Vernon grabbed my arm with a crushing grip. Preston immediately mirrored his actions, grabbing my other arm. They were treating me like a criminal in my own childhood home. Let go of me, I screamed, struggling against their combined weight. Silas tried to stand up his chair, tipping over backward. Leave her alone, Vernon, Silas commanded, his voice thick with age but carrying a fierce authority. You touch my granddaughter and I swear you will regret it. Shut up, old man, Vernon growled, his face twisted into an ugly mask of rage. If you will not sign the papers, we will give you some time to think about your priorities. Vernon and Preston dragged me out of the dining room. I fought back, kicking and twisting, but Preston was surprisingly strong when his fake polite facade dropped. Vernon grabbed Grandpa Silas by the collar of his sweater, roughly hauling the elderly man down the hallway. It was a nightmare unfolding in real time. A father turning on his own daughter, and his own father simply to protect the illusion of status and wealth. They dragged us toward the kitchen, where the door to the unfinished, unheated basement stood open. The basement was a massive concrete cavern that had been under renovation for months. Exposed wires, raw cinder blocks, and absolutely no heating. The temperature outside was dropping below freezing, and the basement was practically a giant icebox. Get down there, Vernon shouted. There was a violent scuffle at the top of the stairs. I managed to wrench one arm free and shoved Preston backward, but Vernon retaliated by shoving me hard by my shoulders. My foot slipped on the top step. I lost my balance entirely. I reached out, grabbing Grandpa Silas to keep him from tumbling forward, but momentum took us both. We fell down the steep wooden stairs, crashing against the hard edges. I twisted my body in midair, wrapping my arms around Silas to shield him from the impact. We hit the concrete floor at the bottom with a sickening thud. Pain exploded in my shoulder and down my back. I groaned, trying to catch my breath in the freezing air, while desperately checking Silas to make sure he was not seriously injured. He was breathing heavily, clutching his ribs, but he nodded to show me he was okay. I looked up toward the top of the stairs just in time to see the heavy steel door swinging shut. The solid metal slammed into the frame. The heavy deadbolt clicked loudly, locking us in absolute darkness. The only light came from the small gaps in the floorboards above. Vernon's voice echoed maliciously through the metal air vents above our heads, dripping with contempt. You two stay down there and freeze until you learn your place in this family. We are going to finish our Christmas dinner. We are not opening this door until the old man agrees to sign the deed. Enjoy the cold, Keisha, maybe it will cool off your stubborn attitude. The metallic echo of the deadbolt sliding into place rang through the freezing air like a gunshot. The heavy steel door at the top of the stairs was sealed shut, shutting out the warm glow of the kitchen and leaving us in absolute suffocating darkness. My shoulder throbbed with a sharp burning pain from the impact of the concrete floor, but I ignored it. I scrambled to my knees, my hands blindly searching the dusty ground until I felt the rough wool of Grandpa Silas' sweater. I was breathing steadily, but the air around us was already turning hostile. It was late December in Atlanta, and an unprecedented cold front had plunged the city into single digits. This basement had been under renovation for nearly a year, stripped down to the raw foundation. There was no insulation, no heating vents, no drywall. The cold was radiating off the cinderblock walls, seeping right through the soles of my shoes. I wrapped my arms around his shoulders, pulling him upright. I guided him toward a stack of discarded wooden shipping crates, setting him down carefully. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer. Vernon might have smashed my personal phone upstairs, but he had no idea. I carried a secondary encrypted mobile device secured on a completely separate network architecture. I was the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar cybersecurity firm. I never walked into a hostile environment without a backup protocol. I pulled the device out and tapped the screen. The harsh blue light illuminated the dust motes dancing in the freezing air, but the status bar in the top corner confirmed my worst fear. Zero signal. Not even a trace of emergency bandwidth. Preston had spent $20,000 of my parents' retirement savings last month installing military-grade cellular jammers around the perimeter of the estate. He convinced Vernon and Beatrice it was necessary to protect his startup's proprietary source code from corporate espionage. The code was garbage, of course, just copied and pasted open-source modules masking a shell company, but the jammers were very real. Right now, they were bouncing every frequency spectrum back at us, trapping us in a digital black hole. I shoved the device back into my pocket, pacing the length of the concrete floor. The cold was becoming aggressive. Every breath I took plumed into thick white vapor. I looked up at the tiny basement windows near the ceiling, but they were reinforced with thick iron security bars Vernon had installed years ago to keep out intruders. Now those same bars were keeping us in. I could hear the faint muffled sound of Christmas music playing upstairs. They were actually up there drinking champagne and eating roasted duck, while leaving an elderly man to freeze in a concrete box. The sheer psychopathy of their status obsession made my blood run cold. I refused to let this happen. I scanned the shadows cast by the ambient light filtering through the floorboards. In the corner near a pile of construction debris, I spotted a heavy loose cinder block. It weighed at least 40 pounds. My injured shoulder screamed in protest as I marched over and hoisted the rough block into my arms. I carried it toward the bottom of the wooden staircase, fixing my eyes on the steel door. If I hit the hinges hard enough and repeatedly, I could warp the metal. I did not care if I broke my own bones doing it. I was going to tear that door off its frame. I raised the heavy concrete block, squaring my stance. "Quiet, Keisha." The voice came from the darkness behind me. I froze, lowering the cinder block slightly. I turned around, squinting into the shadows. Grandpa Silas was sitting on the wooden crate exactly where I left him, but his posture had entirely changed. The hunched shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands, the frail uncertainty that had defined his presence in the house for the last decade, it was all completely gone. He sat perfectly straight, his spine aligned like a military commander. "Put the block down," he commanded, his voice, dropping an octave, resonating with a sharp, lucid authority that I had not heard since I was a little girl. "Let them think they have won for now. They do not know what is behind this wall." I carefully set the cinder block on the floor, staring at him in disbelief. "Grandpa, what are you talking about? We need to get out of here before hypothermia sets in. You cannot survive these temperatures." Silas chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that felt entirely out of place in our freezing prison. He stood up from the crate. His movements were fluid and precise, completely devoid of the arthritis he claimed plagued him every time Beatrice asked him to carry his own dishes. He walked past me, navigating the pitch-black basement flawlessly without stumbling over a single piece of construction debris. He knew this space intimately. He walked straight to the darkest corner of the foundational wall. He ran his hand along the raw cinder blocks, counting them silently under his breath. 3 down, 4 across. He pressed his thumb firmly against the center of one specific block. There was a faint mechanical click. Silas gripped the edges of the rough concrete block and slid it smoothly out of the wall, revealing a dark cavity hidden deep within the foundation. I stepped closer, the cold temporarily forgotten as I watched him reach his arm straight into the empty space. When he pulled his hand back out, he was dragging a heavy matte black steel lockbox. He set it down on the nearest crate. I recognized the make immediately. It was a high-grade titanium biometric vault, the kind my own firm utilized for storing classified physical assets. Silas pressed his right thumb against the dark glass of the scanner. A sharp green LED light flared to life, cutting through the darkness of the basement. The vault hummed and the heavy internal locking mechanism released with a heavy metallic clank. I watched in absolute shock as he lifted the lid. The green light illuminated the contents. Stacked neatly inside were thick bundles of original bearer bonds, velvet pouches that clinked with the heavy sound of uncut diamonds, and several thick legal folios stamped with wax seals. This was not a safety deposit box. This was a war chest. I knew your father was a fool. The very first day he brought Beatrice home to meet me, Silas said casually, sifting through the documents. I saw the way she looked at the expensive china, the way she analyzed the square footage of the property. She did not love my son. She loved the zip code. And Vernon was too weak, too desperate for the approval of high society to see that she would drain this family dry just to impress people who secretly despised her. He pulled out a heavy cream-colored legal document and held it up. So 40 years ago, I took precautions. I let Vernon act like the king of the castle. I let Beatrice host her country club luncheons and pretend she was old money. But I never actually handed over the keys to the kingdom. I legally transferred the master deed of this estate, the ancestral land, and the majority shareholder rights of the family trust into a highly classified shadow holding company. I stared at the document, my mind racing to process the legal implications. You mean they do not own the house? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Silas smiled, his eyes flashing with a brilliant strategic fire. Vernon has been paying property taxes and maintenance on a house he has not legally owned since 1985. They have been living in a decoy. The the ones Preston has been eagerly draining to fund his fake tech startup, are just runoff funds. The real generational wealth, the millions I built from the ground up, have been sitting safely behind corporate veils, multiplying untouched by their greedy hands. He reached deeper into the vault and pulled out a separate manila envelope. It looked newer than the others. He handed it to me. His expression softened, stripping away the hardened business tycoon and revealing the grandfather who used to slip me extra allowance money when Beatrice refused to buy me books. I played the frail old man because it was the only way to observe them honestly, Silas explained, watching me break the seal on the envelope. I needed to see who they truly were when they thought I was powerless. I watched Vernon cater to that arrogant white boy, Preston throwing away his own dignity just to claim a tech executive as a son-in-law. I watched Chantel become a vain, bitter copy of her mother. And I watched how they treated you, Keisha. I watched you take their abuse, their insults, their condescension, and I watched you use it as fuel. You never begged them. You never broke. You just worked harder. I pulled the thick packet of papers from the envelope. The header across the top page was unmistakably clear. It was an irrevocable transfer of ownership documents filed securely through a private wealth management firm. 10 years ago, when Vernon threatened to kick you out of the house because you refused to marry that banker he picked out for you. I made my final decision, Silas said, his voice steady and resolute. I called my attorneys. I transferred the shadow holding company completely out of my name. I scanned the signature lines. My eyes locked onto the beneficiary designation. My name was printed there in bold black ink. Keisha Denise Washington. The effective date was exactly a decade ago. You are the legal owner of this estate, Keisha, Silas said, placing his hand over mine. You own the family trust. You own the ground they are standing on upstairs. You own everything they think gives them power. I gave it to you because you are the only one in this bloodline with the spine and the intellect to protect it. The freezing air in the basement suddenly felt entirely different. It was no longer a trap. It was a war room. I held the deed to the entire estate in my hands, the very same estate my parents had just physically thrown me out of. My father had violently shoved a senior citizen down a flight of stairs over a piece of property that belonged to me. Preston was currently drinking my champagne, celebrating the theft of a house I legally owned. I looked up from the documents, meeting my grandfather's gaze. The shock faded instantly, replaced by the cold, calculating precision that had allowed me to build a $50 million cybersecurity empire from scratch. My family thought they had locked away a helpless woman and a senile old man. They had actually locked themselves inside a cage with the two most dangerous predators in the bloodline. I tucked the thick stack of legal documents back into the manila envelope and zipped it safely inside my jacket. The freezing air in the basement was biting at my exposed skin, making my fingers stiff and clumsy, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me warm. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and sat back down on the wooden crate next to Grandpa Silas. We huddled together, sharing our body heat in the pitch-black concrete box, while the muffled sound of Christmas carols drifted down through the metal air vents. Upstairs they were celebrating. Down here we were holding the keys to their destruction. We sat in the dark, and the reality of the past decade hung heavily between us. All those years of enduring my parents' vicious favoritism suddenly felt like a cruel joke that had finally reached its punchline. I leaned my head against the raw, cinder-block wall and let out a long breath, watching it turn to white mist in the freezing air. "You know what the sickest part is?" I said, my voice steady despite the cold. When Chantel got engaged to Preston, Mom and Dad did not hesitate for a single second to drain $150,000 from their visible accounts to pay for her wedding. I remember watching Beatrice obsess over imported orchids and custom ice sculptures, claiming her daughter deserved a royal celebration. But 3 years before that, when I came to them with a solid business plan and asked for a tiny $5,000 loan to buy refurbished server racks to start my own company, Vernon laughed in my face. Silas shook his head, his jaw tight with anger. "I remember that day, Keisha. He told you that you were wasting your life." "He told me to stop playing with cables and find a husband with a good pension," I corrected bitterly. Beatrice pulled me aside that same afternoon and told me I needed to tame my natural hair and start dressing like a woman who actually wanted to be loved. She said my independence was intimidating and that nobody in their right mind would marry a black woman who acted like she did not need a man. They poured their entire financial foundation into Chantel because she played the game. She married Preston. She gave them the country club aesthetic they were so desperately starved for. Silas reached out and squeezed my hand, his rough palm offering a comforting warmth. "You survived their ignorance, Keisha. But I have to ask you something. You knew I had money. You knew I always believed in you. Why did you never come to me and ask for that $5,000? I looked at him in the dark, and a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I reached into the front pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small, heavy metal object. It was my encrypted biometric backup drive, the one that held the master access keys to my entire corporate infrastructure. I held it up, letting the faint light catch the metallic edges. "I did not need your money, Grandpa," I said softly. "I did not need anyone's money. When Vernon threw me out of the house and told me I was a failure, I spent the next 80 hours awake, writing a proprietary encryption algorithm. I sold the licensing rights to a private defense contractor 6 months later. They think I fix routers for a living. They think I am some low-level IT help desk worker because I let them believe it. It was easier to let them think I was a struggling disappointment than to subject my wealth to their toxic greed." Silas leaned forward, his eyes wide with sharp realization. "How much, Keisha?" "I run a $50 million cybersecurity and forensic auditing firm," I said, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "I hold active government contracts. I audit Fortune 500 companies. I built an empire in the shadows because I learned from the best. I learned from you." Silas threw his head back and laughed, a rich, booming sound of pure joy that echoed off the frozen concrete walls. He slapped his knee, his eyes shining with unshed tears of pride. My brilliant girl, he whispered, shaking his head in awe. You beat them at their own game. Before I could respond, a loud burst of laughter traveled down the air vents from the dining room above us. It was Preston. His smug, arrogant voice filtered through the metal grating clear as day. I am telling you, Vernon, Preston bragged upstairs. The trick to agile scaling is disruptive synergy. You have to aggressively leverage your assets before the market corrects itself. Silas signing the deed is just the first step in our vertical integration. I rolled my eyes, feeling a surge of profound disgust. Listen to him, I muttered, pointing at the ceiling. He strings together meaningless corporate buzzwords and Vernon eats it up like it is gospel. Preston was the ultimate manifestation of mediocre white privilege. He had waltzed into our family wearing Patagonia fleece vests and designer loafers, selling a dream of Silicon Valley prestige. Vernon and Beatrice were so blinded by their desperate need for proximity to whiteness and elite status that they handed him their retirement funds on a silver platter. They practically worshipped him. They excused his blatant disrespect, his condescending tone, and his absolute financial incompetence simply because he represented the societal validation they craved. "He treats you like you are illiterate," I said to Silas, feeling my anger rise again. "And he talks to me like I am the hired help." He literally tried to explain basic firewall protocols to me at Thanksgiving last year. The man has not written a successful line of code in his life, and he is lecturing a cybersecurity CEO about data protection. He is a con artist, Silas stated flatly. A very cheap, very obvious con artist, and your father is the perfect mark. I shivered violently, a sudden blast of cold air, reminding me of our immediate physical reality. The temperature in the basement was dropping fast, and my fingers were starting to go numb. As satisfying as this revelation was, we could not survive down here much longer. Hypothermia was a very real threat, especially for a man of Silas' age. "We need to breach that door," I said, standing up and massaging my injured shoulder. "Preston's signal jammers are blocking my emergency phone. I am going to have to risk breaking my arm to warp those steel hinges with the cinder block." Silas did not move. He just smiled, that same sharp, strategic smile from earlier. He reached out with his boot and kicked away a heavy, moldy rug that had been piled near the wooden crates. Beneath the rug, bolted low to the concrete foundation, was an old, dusty plastic wall plate. "Preston is exactly what you said he is," Silas chuckled. "A cheap con artist. He paid $20,000 to jam the cellular towers, but the boy is too young and too stupid to understand analog infrastructure. He never cut the hard lines." I stared at the old-school RJ11 telephone, jack bolted to the wall. It was a relic from the 90s, a physical copper wire line that ran straight into the city grid, completely immune to wireless signal jammers. Silas reached back into the titanium lockbox and pulled out a vintage heavy-duty handset. He tossed it to me. I caught it, plugging the cord directly into the wall jack. I lifted the receiver to my ear. A loud, clear dial tone buzzed against my eardrum. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I quickly dialed a restricted priority number. It rang exactly once before being answered. "Executive Protection Protocol, state your authorization," a deep voice answered on the other end. "Authorization Blackwood Actual," I said, wrapping my coat tighter around myself. "Code red, extraction required. Location is my parents' residential estate in North Atlanta. I need a full breach team mobilized immediately." "Copy that, boss," the voice responded instantly, recognizing my voice. "We have your GPS coordinates logged from your last known ping. We are 10 minutes out. What is the threat level?" "Hostile but unarmed," I replied. "They locked me and a senior citizen in a freezing basement. Breach the exterior cellar doors on the east side of the property. Do not engage the targets upstairs until I give the order." "Understood. Extraction team is rolling." I hung up the handset and immediately dialed a second number. This time I called my lead forensic auditor, Marcus. Boss Marcus answered, sounding surprised by the late-night call. "It is Christmas. Are you okay?" "I am freezing my off, Marcus," I said bluntly. "But I am about to ruin someone's life. I need you to log into the secure servers right now. I need you to unfreeze all my shadow assets linked to the holding company immediately." "Done," he said, the sound of rapid typing echoing through the receiver. "What else?" "That deep dive forensic audit. I had you running on Preston Holdings for the last 6 months. I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Is the final report compiled?" It has been ready since Tuesday, Marcus confirmed. The guy is a walking felony, Keisha. He has been funneling investor capital into offshore shell companies to cover massive gambling debts. His startup is completely insolvent. Perfect, I said, a cold smile touching my lips. Email the complete dossier to my secure tablet right now. And Marcus, draft an acquisition of debt contract. Buy out all of Preston's outstanding loans from his creditors. Pay pennies on the dollar if you have to, but I want my firm holding exactly 100% of his debt before morning. You got it, boss. Merry Christmas. I hung up the phone and unplugged the handset from the wall, handing it back to Silas. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated pride. The trap was set. The jaws were about to snap shut. We sat in the freezing darkness waiting. The cold was agonizing, seeping into my bones and making my teeth chatter, but the anticipation kept my mind razor sharp. I listened to the muffled sounds of the family upstairs. They were totally oblivious, clinking their crystal glasses and toasting to their stolen wealth. 30 minutes later, the heavy silence of the night was broken. I heard the unmistakable crunch of tactical boots marching across the frozen grass in the backyard. There was a brief pause, followed by the metallic screech of industrial hydraulic tools engaging. The heavy reinforced steel exterior cellar doors were wrenched open with a violent echoing crack. Freezing wind rushed into the basement, accompanied by the blinding beams of high-powered tactical flashlights sweeping across the concrete walls. 4 men dressed in black tactical suits stepped into the basement, lowering their flashlights the moment they saw me standing there. My head of security, a towering man named David, stepped forward and deactivated his flashlight. He looked at the dusty crates and the freezing conditions, his jaw clenching with anger. "Ready to go, boss?" David asked, his voice a low, threatening rumble. I reached down and helped Grandpa Silas to his feet. I dusted off the shoulders of my blazer, holding the manila envelope containing the deeds tightly against my side. "We are not going anywhere, David," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Escort us upstairs. It is time to join the family for a drink." David nodded sharply, signaling his men to form a protective perimeter around Grandpa Silas and me. We marched up the exterior concrete steps of the cellar, leaving the freezing darkness behind. The icy night air bit at my face, but the adrenaline rushing through my veins made me entirely impervious to the cold. Frost crunched loudly under the heavy tactical boots of my security detail as we walked around the sprawling perimeter of the estate. The house was blazing with warm light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. I could see the massive Christmas tree, perfectly decorated in silver and gold, standing in the center of the grand living room. We reached the custom mahogany, double front doors. I did not bother reaching for the handle. I simply stepped back and gave David a look. He raised his heavy combat boot and kicked the doors open with a deafening crash that echoed through the quiet, affluent neighborhood. We swept into the grand foyer in perfect synchronization. The 4 men in black tactical gear fanned out, immediately securing the entrances and hallways with military precision. I walked right down the center of the marble floor with Grandpa Silas walking tall and unbothered beside me. I brushed the dust off the shoulders of my blazer, holding my chin high. The scene in the living room was exactly as I had pictured it. The 4 of them were gathered around the massive stone fireplace, basking in the warmth we had been violently denied. Vernon was leaning back in his leather armchair, holding a glass of scotch. Beatrice was laughing at something Chantel had said. Preston was standing by the mantel, holding a crystal flute filled with vintage Dom Perignon mid-toast to his own perceived brilliance. When the front doors crashed open, the entire room froze. Preston jumped, dropping his champagne flute. The crystal shattered against the imported marble, sending expensive liquor splashing across the pristine white rug. Beatrice screamed, clutching her chest as her silver dessert fork clattered to the floor. Vernon vaulted out of his armchair, his face draining of all color as he took in the sight of 4 massive security operatives taking control of his house. "How did you get out?" Vernon stammered, his voice cracking with panic. He looked from me to the tactical team, his eyes wide with fear. "Who the hell are these thugs? Get out of my house before I call the police." I walked slowly into the center of the living room, relishing the absolute terror in his eyes. I took a seat right at the head of the formal dining table, crossing my legs and folding my hands in my lap. "They aren't thugs, Vernon," I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. They are my employees, and they are not going anywhere. Chantel scrambled up from the sofa, her designer gown swishing around her ankles. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her face twisted with that familiar spoiled rage. "You are insane, Keisha," she shrieked. "You broke into our house with armed men. I am calling the cops right now. You are going to jail." She snatched her phone off the coffee table, waving it like a weapon. I did not even flinch. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my own secondary device, and slid it smoothly across the mahogany table toward her. "Go ahead, Chantel," I offered, offering a cold, razor-sharp smile. "Call them. Dial 911. Tell the dispatcher you need officers dispatched to this address. But while you have them on the line, make sure you mention that you and your husband physically assaulted a senior citizen and locked us in a freezing basement without heat or communication. Let us see exactly who they put in handcuffs first." Chantel froze, her thumb hovering over the screen. She looked at Preston, desperately searching for him to take control of the situation. Preston stepped forward, trying to puff out his chest and use his height to intimidate me, just like he always did. He smoothed down his expensive vest, projecting that sickeningly familiar aura of white corporate privilege. "Listen to me, you angry, delusional woman," Preston sneered, trying to keep his voice steady, but failing to hide the slight tremor. "You think you can just hire some rent-a-cops and barge in here making demands. You do not understand high-level finance or how the real world works. Silas needs to sign that deed tonight, or this entire family loses out on a massive equity opportunity. You are throwing away millions because you are too stupid to see the big picture." I let out a slow, genuine laugh. The sound bounced off the high vaulted ceilings, making Preston visibly flinch. I looked at David and gave him a curt nod. David reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a sleek encrypted tablet. He handed it to me. I unlocked it with my fingerprint, pulled up the central dashboard of my firm's forensic auditing software, and tossed the tablet onto the coffee table right in front of Preston. "I understand high-level finance perfectly," Preston, I said, leaning forward, my tone shifting from casual to lethal. "Which is exactly why my forensic auditing firm just confirmed that your brilliant tech startup officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy this morning." The room went dead silent. Vernon stopped breathing. Beatrice covered her mouth with her hand. Preston looked like he had just been struck by lightning. His eyes darted down to the tablet, illuminating the undeniable legal filings bearing his company's name. "That is right, Preston." I continued, my voice ringing with total authority. "I did not just hire security. I own a $50 million cybersecurity and financial auditing empire. While you were busy talking down to me at every family dinner explaining basic computer networking to a woman who holds active federal security clearances, my team was ripping your digital footprint to shreds. We spent the last 6 months conducting a deep dive forensic audit on your entire corporate structure." Preston opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His arrogant facade was melting away, revealing the desperate, cowardly con artist underneath. I turned my attention to my father. Vernon was staring at the tablet, his hands shaking. "Look at the highlighted sections on the screen," Vernon, I instructed coldly. "Go ahead, read the routing numbers." Vernon slowly picked up the tablet. His eyes scanned the data, and I watched his entire world completely collapse in real time. "I has not been building an application," Vernon, I explained, dissecting the scam piece by piece for the entire room to hear. "He took the $100,000 from the family trust. He took the $200,000 from your liquidated retirement accounts. He funneled every single penny through a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. And then he wired it directly to underground sports betting syndicates and offshore loan sharks. Your brilliant son-in-law is a degenerate gambler with a massive losing streak. Your retirement fund paid for his bad bets on international horse racing." Vernon dropped the tablet. It clattered against the wood. He grabbed his chest, gasping for air as he looked at Preston. "Tell me she is lying." Vernon choked out, his voice filled with a devastating, pathetic desperation. "Tell me you did not lose my money, Preston. Tell me you have the app." Preston took a step backward, bumping into the fireplace mantel. He looked like a cornered animal. "It was a temporary liquidity issue," he stammered, spitting out useless corporate jargon to defend the indefensible. The market was volatile. I just needed to leverage the house to cover the margins. I was going to win it back. I just needed the house. Beatrice let out a high-pitched wail, dropping to her knees on the expensive rug. No, she sobbed, clutching her hair. No, you said you were taking us to the next level. You said we were going to be elite. My money, my country club fees. We are ruined. Chantel rushed forward, her face contorted with denial. She shoved the tablet away and glared at me, her eyes wild. You fabricated this! She screamed, her voice cracking. You forged these documents because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of me and Preston. You made this all up because nobody wants to marry you. You are a liar, Keisha. I sat back in my chair, completely unbothered by her hysterical screaming. I looked at Grandpa Silas, who was standing quietly by the doorway, watching the chaos unfold with a look of profound vindication on his face. I did not forge anything, Chantel, I said, my voice slicing cleanly through her frantic crying. Every single byte of that data is verified by federal banking ledgers. But since you brought up the topic of forged documents and fraudulent claims, let us talk about that property deed you and your husband locked an elderly man in a freezing basement for. Let us talk about who actually owns the ground you are currently crying on. I reached inside my blazer and pulled out the thick manila envelope Grandpa Silas had handed me in the freezing darkness of the basement. I tossed it onto the table right on top of the shattered glass and spilled champagne. The heavy paper landed with a satisfying thud. You are out of your mind! Vernon snarled, his chest heaving as he stared at the envelope. I bought this house. I paid the taxes. I maintained the grounds. My name is on the municipal registry. You do not own anything here. Grandpa Silas stepped forward, moving past the security guards to stand directly beside me. The look on his face was one of absolute patriarchal authority, a side of him Vernon had not seen in decades. Silas placed his hands on the back of my chair and looked his son dead in the eye. You own nothing, Vernon Silas said, his voice booming with a heavy resonance that commanded the entire room. You have not owned a single brick of this house since 1985. Vernon recoiled as if he had been physically struck. What are you talking about? He whispered. When you married Beatrice. I saw exactly what kind of future this family was heading toward. Silas explained, his tone devoid of any sympathy. I saw the greed. I saw the desperate need to impress people who do not care about you. So I took precautions. I legally transferred the master deed of this estate, the ancestral land, and the majority shareholder rights of the family trust into a highly classified shadow holding company. You have been living in a decoy, Vernon. You were just a tenant paying the upkeep on a property you never legally possessed. Beatrice let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest. This is a lie, she cried, looking frantically from Silas to Vernon. Tell me it is a lie, Vernon. Tell me we still have the house. I reached out and untied the string on the manila envelope. I pulled out the original notarized documents and slid them across the mahogany table, stopping them right in front of Beatrice. It is not a lie, I said, leaning forward. Silas held the keys to the kingdom for decades, but 10 years ago, when you threatened to kick me out onto the street because I refused to marry that awful banker you picked out to boost your country club status, Grandpa Silas made a decision. He transferred the shadow holding company. I tapped my perfectly manicured fingernail against the signature line on the top document. As of 10 years ago, I am the sole owner of the holding company. I stated the absolute finality of my words, suffocating the room. I own the family trust. I own the ground beneath your feet. You are trespassing in my house. The reality crashed down on Beatrice and Vernon like a collapsing building. Their country club status, their wealth, their entire carefully curated identity was an absolute mirage. Beatrice immediately tried to backtrack. She threw herself forward, tears streaming down her face, her voice taking on a sickly sweet pleading tone that I had not heard since I was a child. Keisha, my beautiful daughter. Beatrice sobbed, reaching out to grab my hand across the table. I pulled my hand away in disgust. We were just trying to push you to be your best. We love you. You are our flesh and blood. You know we never meant to hurt you. We are family. We have to stick together. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life belittling my natural hair, my intelligence, and my independence. You do not love me, Beatrice, I said, stripping her of the title of mother. You love status. You love proximity to wealth. You loved Preston because he was white and wore a suit, and you thought he could buy you a ticket into the elite circles you were so desperate to infiltrate. You traded your own daughter for a country club membership. Do not ever use the word family with me again. Vernon ignored me, turning his desperate, tear-filled eyes toward Silas. Dad, please, Vernon begged, his voice cracking. You cannot let her do this to me. I am your son. We can fix this. I will kick Preston out right now. Just give me back my house. Please, Dad. Silas looked down at Vernon with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. You let this con artist physically assault me, Vernon. You threw your own father and your own daughter into a freezing basement to protect a lie. Silas shook his head, stepping away from the table. You sold your soul for a country club membership and a son-in-law who despises you. You are no son of mine. Preston, who had been standing frozen by the fireplace, suddenly snapped out of his shock. His face flushed a dark, angry red. He pointed a shaking finger at me, dropping the polite corporate facade entirely. You think you are so smart? You arrogant dropout? Preston spat, his voice dripping with venom. You illegally hacked into my financial records. I am going to sue you for defamation. I am going to sue your fake cybersecurity firm into the ground. My lawyers will destroy you. I leaned back in my chair, offering him the coldest smile I could muster. I delivered the fatal blow without raising my voice. I did not just audit your company, Preston, I said softly. When I made the call from the basement, I authorized my firm to buy out all of your debt from your creditors. Every single one of your offshore loans, every penny you owe to those underground syndicates. We bought it all for pennies on the dollar. Preston's arm dropped to his side, his mouth hanging open. I am your sole largest creditor. I continued, relishing the absolute terror washing over his face. You owe me $4 million, Preston. And because you locked the legal owner of this property and a senior citizen in a freezing basement, my security team already sent the interior surveillance footage to the Fulton County District Attorney. Right on cue, the faint wail of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder and louder as they sped through the affluent neighborhood. Did you really think I would not have hidden cameras inside my own house? I asked, tilting my head. You are going to federal prison for wire fraud and elder endangerment. Flashing blue and red lights illuminated the massive front windows, casting erratic shadows across the living room. The heavy mahogany doors were thrown wide open. 6 Atlanta police officers burst into the foyer, their hands resting on their holsters. My security chief, David, stepped forward, presenting his credentials to the lead officer and handing him a secure tablet containing the pristine surveillance footage from the basement hallway. The officer watched the video for exactly 5 seconds before looking up and locking eyes with Preston. Preston tried to run. He bolted toward the kitchen, but 2 of my security operatives grabbed him by his custom-tailored suit, hauling him backward. The police stepped in, slamming him against the wall and clicking heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. Preston screamed obscenities, thrashing and kicking, completely stripped of his arrogant privilege. Chantel collapsed onto the floor, hyperventilating. She fell to her knees, her expensive designer gown soaking up the spilled champagne and tears. She reached out for Preston, but the officers were already dragging him out the front door. I stood up from the table, adjusting the lapels of my blazer. I turned to David. Escort Vernon, Beatrice, and Chantel off my property. They are allowed 1 suitcase each. If they take longer than 10 minutes, call the police to have them removed for criminal trespassing. Beatrice wailed, a gut-wrenching sound of total despair, as the security guards stepped forward to escort them upstairs. I watched from the doorway, arm in arm with Grandpa Silas, as they were forced out into the freezing cold night, pulling cheap rolling suitcases behind them. The heavy front door clicked shut, locking them out of the life they thought they owned forever. 6 months later, the Atlanta skyline glittered outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corporate headquarters. I stood by the glass holding a cup of hot coffee, watching the morning traffic flow through the city. The aftermath of that Christmas night had been swift and merciless. Preston was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary, awaiting trial for multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and elder endangerment. He was facing 20 years. Chantel, having never worked a real job in her life, was currently living in a cramped studio apartment and working a minimum wage retail job at a local mall. Vernon and Beatrice were renting a tiny unit on the outskirts of the city, completely ostracized by their former high society friends who wanted absolutely nothing to do with a public fraud scandal. The double doors of my office swung open. Grandpa Silas walked in wearing a sharp tailored suit, looking healthier and happier than I had seen him in years. He had moved into my luxury penthouse the very next morning, where he was treated with the ultimate respect and care he deserved. He walked over to my desk, pouring himself a cup of coffee and raising it toward me. "To the smartest woman in Atlanta," he said, a proud smile lighting up his face. I raised my mug, clinking it against his. I was no longer the family scapegoat. I was no longer the disappointment who had to endure the suffocating weight of their conditional love. I had dismantled their toxic empire and built my own on a foundation of absolute truth. I looked out over the city entirely at peace, knowing that real power does not require a country club membership. Real power is silent until it is time to strike. The sharp pop of a champagne cork echoed down the galvanized steel air duct directly above our heads. The sound was followed immediately by Chantel's shrill melodic giggle and Preston's booming arrogant laughter. They were literally drinking a toast to our demise while we sat freezing in the dark. I tilted my head back against the raw cinder block wall, listening to the muffled voices filtering through the metal grating. Preston was holding court in the dining room, loudly praising his own strategic brilliance and mocking how easily they had secured their financial future. I looked over at Grandpa Silas and shook my head in pure disgust. It is absolutely sickening how easily he dismantled them. I whispered, my voice tight with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He did not even have to try. He just walked into our house wearing a designer fleece vest, spouting empty corporate jargon, and they handed him the keys to the kingdom. Silas let out a heavy sigh, his breath pluming into a thick white cloud in the freezing air. Your parents were always easy marks, Keisha. They have spent their entire adult lives chasing the validation of people who do not even respect them. That was the painful, undeniable truth. Vernon and Beatrice were so obsessed with maintaining their image among the affluent black elite of Atlanta that they had completely lost their grip on reality. They worshipped proximity to whiteness and perceived prestige. When Chantel first brought Preston home to dinner 3 years ago, my parents practically rolled out a red carpet. They were mesmerized by his confident posture, his expensive loafers, and his tall tales of Silicon Valley disruption. They did not see a struggling grifter with a failing app. They saw a trophy. They saw a white tech executive son-in-law who would finally give them the ultimate bragging rights at their exclusive country club luncheons. Preston recognized their desperation immediately, and he played them perfectly. He weaponized his privilege from day one. I leaned closer to Silas, rubbing my arms vigorously to generate some friction against the biting cold. "Do you remember last Thanksgiving?" I asked, my teeth beginning to chatter. Preston cornered me in the kitchen while I was preparing the yams. He stood there swirling his expensive bourbon and decided to lecture me about network security. He actually tried to explain basic data encryption to me using words like blockchain and disruptive synergy. Silas chuckled, a low, bitter sound. "I remember watching him talk down to you. He spoke to you like you were a slow child." "Exactly," I said. "I let him talk for 20 minutes straight. He just assumed that because I am a black woman who fixes computers, I must be some glorified help desk drone." His inherent arrogance completely blinded him to my actual intellect. He never once bothered to ask the name of my company. He never asked to see my client portfolio. He just looked at me, saw someone who did not fit his narrow definition of a corporate founder, and dismissed me entirely. I was so busy feeling superior that he never realized he was lecturing a woman who holds active federal security clearances and audits the very financial institutions he is currently defrauding. "And your parents ate up every word he said," Silas added, his tone hardening. "Beatrice actually defended him when you finally walked away. She told you to be more respectful of his expertise. They handed him their entire retirement savings because he promised them board seats and elite status." I continued feeling the familiar sting of their betrayal. They ignored every single red flag. When his company failed to produce a viable product after 2 years, Vernon made excuses for him. When Preston started taking mysterious business trips to Las Vegas and Macau, Beatrice claimed he was just networking with global investors. They were so desperate to buy their way into his world that they completely ignored the fact that he was financially bleeding them dry. The temperature in this basement was dropping aggressively. The concrete floor felt like a block of solid ice beneath my shoes. I could feel the cold seeping through the fabric of my blazer, settling deep into my bones. I watched Silas carefully. His hands were tucked under his armpits, but I could see his shoulders shivering. His lips were taking on a faint blue tint in the dim light filtering through the floorboards above. The situation was shifting from a strategic standoff to a critical medical emergency. "We cannot wait them out down here," I said, standing up. My injured shoulder throbbed with a sharp burning pain, but I forced myself to ignore it. The cold is getting dangerous. Hypothermia is going to set in within the hour, especially for you, Grandpa. We have to breach that door before our core temperatures drop too low. I turned toward the heavy steel door at the top of the wooden stairs, calculating the structural integrity of the hinges. I figured if I could find a heavy enough piece of debris, I could smash the locking mechanism. It would be loud, and it would alert Vernon and Preston immediately, but we had no other choice. I started scanning the shadows cast by the ambient light, searching for a metal pipe or a heavy tool left behind by the renovation crew. Silas did not panic. He did not share my sense of frantic urgency. He simply sat on his wooden crate and offered a slow, deliberate smirk. He stood up, his movements surprisingly fluid despite the freezing temperatures. "We do not need to break the door, Keisha," Silas said, his voice ringing with that same sharp, lucid authority he had used when he first revealed the hidden vault. "We just need to make a phone call." I stopped pacing and looked at him in confusion. "I told you Grandpa Preston installed military-grade cellular jammers around the entire perimeter of the estate. My encrypted backup device cannot even catch a single bar of signal. We are in a digital black hole. We have absolutely no wireless communication." Silas chuckled, walking over to a pile of discarded construction materials near the far wall. "Preston is exactly what you said he is, Keisha. A cheap, obvious con artist." He kicked away a heavy, moldy rug that had been piled near the foundation. Beneath the rug, bolted low to the raw concrete wall, was an old, dusty plastic plate. "I paid $20,000 of your father's money to jam the cellular towers," Silas said, crouching down and brushing the dust off the plastic plate. "But the boy is too young and too stupid to understand analog infrastructure. He never cut the hard lines." I stared at the old-school telephone jack bolted to the wall. It was a physical copper wire line that ran straight into the city grid, completely immune to any wireless signal jammers Preston had installed. Silas reached back into the titanium lockbox and pulled out a vintage, heavy-duty telephone handset. He tossed it through the freezing air. I caught it perfectly, feeling a surge of pure adrenaline eradicate the cold. This was the moment everything changed. I was about to tear their perfect false reality to shreds. I caught the heavy plastic receiver, my numb fingers fumbling for a second before gripping it tight. I slammed the cord into the RJ11 jack bolted to the damp concrete. A crisp, uninterrupted dial tone buzzed against my ear. It was the absolute sweetest sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. My fingers danced across the keypad, punching in a restricted priority number I had memorized for absolute emergencies. It rang exactly once. "Executive Protection, state your authorization," a deep voice barked over the line. "Authorization, Blackwood, actual." I said, my teeth chattering as the freezing air whipped around us. Code red, extraction required. Location is my parents' residential estate in North Atlanta. I need a full tactical breach team mobilized immediately. My head of security. Tavon recognized my voice instantly. The background noise on his end shifted immediately from a quiet office to the sound of heavy gear moving. "Copy that, boss. We have your GPS coordinates logged from your last known ping. What is the threat level?" "Hostile but unarmed," I replied, wrapping my wool coat tightly around Grandpa Silas' shoulders. "They locked me and a senior citizen in a freezing basement. Breach the exterior cellar doors on the east side of the property. Do not engage the targets upstairs until I give the explicit order. I want them contained, not spooked. Understood, Tevin responded, his voice a low professional rumble. Extraction team is rolling. 10 minutes out. I depressed the receiver switch, getting a fresh dial tone, and immediately punched in a second number. My lead forensic auditor, Desmond, answered on the second ring. Boss, Desmond asked, sounding surprised by the late-night call. It is Christmas night, are you all right? I am freezing in a concrete box because my family decided to play wardens, I said bluntly. But I am about to ruin their entire reality. I need you at your terminal right now. Log into the secure corporate servers. Unfreeze all my shadow assets linked to the master holding company immediately. Remove the corporate veils and make everything visible to the primary accounts. Done, Desmond said, the rapid clacking of a mechanical keyboard echoing over the line. What else? That deep dive forensic audit. I had you running on Preston's startup for the last 6 months, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Is the final report compiled? It has been ready since Tuesday, Desmond confirmed. The guy is a walking felony, Keisha. He has been funneling investor capital into offshore shell companies to cover massive gambling debts. His tech startup is completely insolvent. He has absolutely zero liquid capital. Perfect, I said, a cold smile touching my lips, despite the biting chill in the air. Email the complete dossier to my secure tablet right now. And Desmond draft an acquisition of debt contract. Buy out all of Preston's outstanding loans from his creditors. Pay pennies on the dollar if you have to, but I want my firm holding exactly 100% of his debt before morning. I want to be the one who owns him. You got it, boss. Merry Christmas. I hung up the phone and unplugged the handset from the wall, handing it back to Silas. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated pride. The trap was set. The jaws were about to snap shut. We sat in the freezing darkness, waiting. The cold was agonizing, seeping into my bones and making my joints ache, but the intense anticipation kept my mind razor-sharp. I listened to the muffled sounds of the family upstairs. They were totally oblivious, clinking their crystal glasses and toasting to their stolen wealth. You planned for this, Silas whispered, his breath forming a thick white cloud in the dark. You investigated that boy before tonight. I audit Fortune 500 companies for a living. Grandpa, I replied softly, rubbing my arms to generate friction. When Beatrice brought a mediocre white man in a Patagonia vest to Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago and told me he was the next Steve Jobs, my instincts screamed. I ran a background check on Preston before they even finished carving the turkey. I saw the empty shell companies. I saw the leveraged debt. But I knew Vernon and Beatrice would never believe me. Silas shook his head, his jaw tight with anger. To them, his whiteness and his corporate jargon equated to automatic competence. Exactly, I said, my voice hardening with years of suppressed frustration. If I, their dark-skinned, natural-haired daughter, who they thought fixed routers for a living, tried to warn them, they would have called me a jealous, bitter black woman. They would have accused me of trying to sabotage Chantel's happiness. They worship proximity to what they think is elite. They handed Preston their retirement funds because he made them feel like they belonged to a club that secretly despises them. Silas reached out and gripped my shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong despite the frigid temperature. You survived their ignorance, Keisha. You built an empire right under their noses. I did, I said, leaning my head back against the concrete wall. I let them believe whatever they wanted. For 10 years I endured their insults. I let Chantel flaunt her designer bags paid for by Vernon's dwindling savings. Beatrice tell her country club friends that I was a struggling IT worker who could not find a husband because I was too intimidating. Because while they were busy trying to maintain a fake image, I was building a real empire. I looked at the small gaps of light shining through the floorboards above us. I took the the constant belittling, the absolute lack of support, and I weaponized it. Do you know how many nights I sat in my first studio apartment eating ramen, watching Chantel post pictures from Paris on Vernon's credit card? I did not complain. I just worked 80-hour weeks. I secured federal contracts. I bought out competitors. I used their underestimation of me as the ultimate shield. They never looked my way, which meant they never saw me coming. You are the true heir to this family, Keisha, Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. You have the grit your father never had. The cold was becoming critical. I could feel my toes going numb in my boots. I pulled Silas closer, wrapping my body around his to preserve our core temperatures. We had to hold on just a little longer. Above us, the bass from the stereo thumped against the floorboards. Chantel was probably dancing in the living room, celebrating her husband's brilliant maneuver of locking her own sister and grandfather in a freezer to extort a property deed. The absolute sheer entitlement of it made my jaw clench. They thought they were untouchable. They thought the world belonged to them because they wore the right clothes and repeated the right buzzwords. They had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet legally belonged to the very woman they had just thrown down a flight of stairs. I checked my watch, the luminescent dial glowing faintly in the dark. 28 minutes had passed. My security team was elite, comprised of former military operators who specialized in rapid extractions. They would not be late. Suddenly, the heavy silence of the winter night outside was broken. I heard the unmistakable crunch of tactical boots marching across the frozen grass in the backyard. The footsteps were heavy, synchronized, and moving with aggressive purpose. There was a brief, tense pause outside the cellar. Then came the metallic screech of industrial hydraulic tools engaging. The heavy reinforced steel exterior storm doors of the cellar were wrenched open with a violent echoing crack. Freezing wind rushed into the basement, accompanied by the blinding beams of high-powered tactical flashlights sweeping across the concrete walls. 4 men dressed in black tactical suits stepped into the basement, lowering their flashlights, the absolute moment they saw me standing there. My head of security. Tavon stepped forward and deactivated his light. He looked at the dusty crates and the freezing conditions, his jaw clenching with barely contained fury. "Ready to go, boss?" Tavon asked, his voice a low, threatening rumble. I gave Tavon a single sharp nod. "I am more than ready. Let us go introduce my family to the real world." Tavon signaled his team with a quick gesture of his hand. The 4 men moved with the kind of terrifying synchronized precision that money and elite military backgrounds buy. 2 operatives flanked Grandpa Silas, offering him a sturdy arm to lean on, while the other 2 formed a protective wedge in front of us. We did not scramble out of the cellar like frightened victims fleeing into the frozen Atlanta night. We marched up the raw concrete steps with the heavy, deliberate tread of an invading army. The transition from the freezing basement to the main house was jarring. The moment Tavon breached the interior door leading up to the kitchen, a wave of heated air washed over my face, carrying the rich, heavy scents of roasted duck, expensive imported spices, and Beatrice's signature pine holiday candles. It smelled like wealth. It smelled like the very illusion they had just tried to kill us to protect. We stepped into the kitchen, and the sheer visual contrast was staggering. Beatrice had spent nearly $80,000 remodeling this specific room, importing seamless Italian marble countertops and custom cabinetry, just so she could brag about it to the other women at her country club luncheons. She used to scream at me if I even placed a water glass on the island without a coaster. Now the heavy mud-caked tactical boots of my security team were leaving thick dark tracks all over her pristine white floors. I looked down at the dirty footprints and felt a deep, satisfying surge of vindication. We were tracking reality right into their spotless fake lives. Tavon held up his fist, signaling us to pause just outside the closed double doors that led into the formal dining and living area. The heavy mahogany doors muffled the sound, but I could hear them perfectly. The crackle of the massive stone fireplace, the clinking of crystal flutes, and the sound of Preston's smug, booming voice echoing through the high ceilings. I motioned for the team to hold their position for a moment. I wanted to hear exactly what they were saying. I wanted to hear how they justified leaving an elderly man and their own daughter to freeze in the dark. "It is all about the long game," Vernon Preston was saying, his voice dripping with that sickeningly familiar, unearned authority. "You and Beatrice understand how real wealth is maintained. Silas is just resting his eyes down there. The cold will give him a little perspective. By tomorrow morning he will be begging to sign that deed, and we will finally be able to optimize the family trust. You have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, right?" I heard Chantel giggle, that high-pitched grating sound she always made when she was trying to sound like a supportive corporate wife. "You are so brilliant, babe," she cooed. "Keisha could never understand this level of strategy. She probably thinks you need to fix a router to make $1 million. I am so glad we are finally securing our future. Vernon chuckled a deep, relaxed sound that made my stomach turn. You are a lifesaver, Preston, Vernon said, completely surrendering his patriarchal authority to a white con artist who was actively robbing him blind. I admit I was worried about the liquidity issue, but you clearly have the vision to take this family to the elite tier, to disruptive synergy. To disruptive synergy, Preston echoed proudly, followed by the distinct sound of 4 crystal champagne flutes clinking together in a celebratory toast. They were drinking vintage Dom Perignon, toasting to their own genius while actively committing elder abuse and kidnapping. The sheer audacity, the absolute delusion of their bubble was beyond comprehension. They genuinely believed they were untouchable. They believed that because they lived in a gated community and wore designer clothes, consequences simply did not apply to them. I looked at Grandpa Silas. He was standing tall, gripping his wooden cane not for support but like a scepter. His eyes were burning with a fierce, cold judgment. I turned to Tavon and gave him the final signal. Open it, I whispered. Tavon did not bother turning the brass handles. He simply planted his heavy combat boots squarely against the center, where the double doors met, and kicked forward with explosive force. The mahogany doors burst open with a deafening crash, slamming violently against the interior walls. The laughter in the living room died instantly. We swept into the room like a localized hurricane. The 4 operatives fanned out immediately, moving with lethal efficiency to secure the perimeter of the room. Their black tactical gear, radio earpieces, and imposing physical presence instantly sucked every ounce of oxygen out of the space. Silas and I walked right through the center of the formation, stepping onto the priceless Persian rug. Preston was standing right by the roaring fireplace, his arm wrapped around Chantel's waist, holding his champagne flute high in the air, mid-toast. When his eyes locked onto the heavily armed tactical team, and then onto me, his face went completely slack. The color drained from his cheeks so fast he looked like a ghost. His fingers went limp. The crystal flute slipped from his hand and plummeted to the floor. It shattered violently against the marble hearth, sending expensive vintage champagne splashing across Chantel's designer heels and seeping deep into the expensive rug. Chantel jumped backward, letting out a sharp, terrified shriek as the glass exploded near her feet. Beatrice, who was sitting gracefully on the velvet sofa, dropped her jaw so wide she looked almost comical. She clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes darting frantically between the tactical operators blocking the exits. Vernon vaulted out of his custom leather armchair. He stumbled forward, his knees practically knocking together. He looked at the massive men in black uniforms, and then stared at me and Silas, standing completely unharmed and radiating absolute authority. The patriarch of the house, the man who had violently shoved us down a flight of stairs just hours earlier, was now trembling like a terrified child. What? Vernon choked out, his voice cracking with high-pitched panic. What is the meaning of this? How did you get out? I took a step forward, but Tavon immediately shifted his weight, placing his hand resting near his tactical belt, blocking Vernon's path. Vernon froze, his chest heaving as he stared at the security chief. Vernon looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and furious indignation. He tried desperately to summon his usual domineering presence, to put the mask of the untouchable wealthy father back on. "Who are these thugs?" Vernon demanded, pointing a shaking finger at Tavon. "How dare you bring street criminals into my home? Get these people out of my house right now before I call the police and have you all arrested for breaking and entering." I did not yell. I did not rush. I took my time. I walked slowly and deliberately past Preston, who was actively shrinking against the fireplace mantel. I walked past Chantel, who was staring at me as if I had just risen from the dead. I moved straight toward the heavy carved oak chair at the absolute head of the formal dining table. The seat that Vernon always occupied. The seat that symbolized the head of the family. I pulled the chair out smoothly and sat down, crossing my legs and folding my hands neatly on the polished wood. I looked down the length of the table, making deliberate eye contact with my father, who was watching me take his throne in absolute stunned silence. "They aren't thugs, Vernon," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying a cold, sharp resonance that commanded the entire room. "They are my employees." The shock on Vernon's face is absolute. He stares at the tactical gear, at the communication earpieces, at the cold, disciplined stance of the men surrounding us. He tries to speak, but his throat seems to have closed up entirely. I instruct Taven, my security chief, to block the exits. Taven gives a subtle hand signal, and his operatives move flawlessly. Two men plant themselves firmly in front of the main mahogany doors, blocking the exit to the grand foyer. The other two position themselves at the archway leading into the kitchen. The trap is officially sealed. Nobody is leaving this dining room until I say so. Chantel finally breaks the silence. Her voice is shrill, bordering on hysterical, as she realizes the physical reality of the situation. "You cannot do this, Keisha," she screams, her manicured hands balling into fists at her sides. "This is a hostage situation. This is illegal. You brought armed men into our home. I am calling the cops right now, and you are going to spend the rest of your pathetic life in a federal prison." She frantically starts digging through her expensive sequined clutch, searching for her phone. I do not blink. I do not raise my voice. I simply reach into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer, pull out my secondary encrypted device, and slide it smoothly across the long, polished dining table. It glides over the smooth wood and bumps gently against her untouched plate of roasted duck. "Go ahead, Chantel," I say, my voice perfectly calm, radiating a terrifying serenity. The phone is unlocked. Dial 911. Tell the dispatcher you have an emergency. But make sure you speak clearly when you explain that you and your husband physically assaulted a 78-year-old man and shoved him down a flight of stairs into a freezing concrete basement. Tell them you locked the deadbolt and left him there to die so you could extort his signature on a property deed. Let us see exactly who the Atlanta Police Department arrests first. Chantel's hand hovers over my phone, trembling violently. She looks at the glowing screen and then looks up at me, her eyes wide with sudden terror. She realizes I am not bluffing. She slowly pulls her hand back, wrapping her arms around her stomach and stepping backward until she hits the edge of the velvet sofa. Seeing his wife back down, Preston decides it is time to intervene. He sets his jaw and steps forward, puffing out his chest. He relies on his height, trying to loom over me at the head of the table. It is the exact same tactic he used since the day he infiltrated this family. He leans heavily on his white privilege, playing the role of the dominant, authoritative tech executive to intimidate a black woman he automatically assumes is beneath him. Preston takes a menacing step toward me, slamming both of his hands flat onto the mahogany table. The sudden aggressive movement causes Tavon to instantly step forward, his hand resting firmly on the heavy tactical belt at his waist. I raise a single finger, signaling my security chief to stand down. I do not need a bodyguard to handle a coward. I look Preston dead in the eye, completely unfazed by his pathetic display of physical intimidation. "You think you can just hire some private muscle and walk in here making demands?" Preston sneers, leaning over the table so his face is only inches from mine. His voice drips with that sickeningly familiar corporate condescension. "You are completely unhinged, Keisha. You are acting like an angry, delusional dropout. You march in here playing boss, but you have absolutely no idea how the real world operates." I sit back in my father's heavy oak chair, refusing to shrink away from him. I tilt my head, studying him like a pathetic specimen under a microscope. "Is that right, Preston?" I ask, keeping my tone dead flat. "You do not understand high-level finance." Preston continues, pacing slightly, his confidence artificially inflated by years of going unchallenged in this house. "You do not understand venture capital or asset leveraging. Silas signing that deed was a strategic liquidity move to save a multi-million-dollar enterprise. But you cannot comprehend that because you run a glorified geek squad. You fix computers for a living. You are completely out of your depth here. You should be thanking me on your knees for stepping in to manage this family's portfolio, because clearly, none of you people know how to build real wealth." The sheer racial audacity of his statement hangs heavily in the air, but my parents are too brainwashed to even register the insult. My mother, Beatrice, suddenly finds her courage from her spot near the fireplace. She clutches her pearl necklace, nodding furiously in agreement with Preston. "Listen to your brother-in-law, Keisha," she demands, her voice shrill and desperate to maintain her illusion of control. "He is a chief executive officer. He deals with high-net-worth investors and global markets. You are making a fool of yourself. Call off these men and apologize to Preston before the neighbors see those security vehicles outside and ruin our reputation permanently. The absolute blindness of my parents is staggering. They are standing in a room secured by my private military contractors, facing a daughter who just escaped their freezing death trap, and they are still aggressively defending the white con artist who is actively robbing them blind. They are so deeply desperate for his perceived status that they are willing to ignore their own impending ruin. They would rather sacrifice their own blood than admit they were conned by a man who uses words like synergy to mask his total incompetence. Beatrice points a shaking finger at me. Chantel married a brilliant man. Beatrice shrieks, her perfectly styled hair trembling. You are just trying to destroy your sister's happiness out of pure spite, because no man of his caliber would ever look twice at you. You are nothing but a jealous, bitter woman. I look at Vernon, who is gripping the edge of the fireplace mantel, his knuckles turning white. You agree with him, Vernon? I ask sharply, refusing to call him Dad. You think Preston is a financial genius who just needs your ancestral house to save his brilliant company. Vernon avoids my eyes, staring at the Persian rug beneath his feet. Preston is trying to elevate this family, Vernon mutters weakly, his voice lacking any real conviction. He has a vision for our future. I let out a slow, dark laugh that cuts through the tension in the room like a physical blade. The warm, opulent dining room with its crackling fire and expensive imported crystal stands in sharp, sickening contrast to the freezing concrete box they just left me and Grandpa Silas to die in. I look over at Silas, who is standing quietly near the doorway, gripping his wooden cane. His eyes are burning with a fierce, cold judgment as he watches his son choose a fraudulent stranger over his own family. I look back at Preston. He stands there with his arms crossed, wearing his expensive fleece vest and tailored slacks, looking so incredibly smug. He actually believes his own lies. He thinks his Silicon Valley buzzwords and his unearned arrogance make him bulletproof. He thinks he can talk his way out of this because society has always given him a free pass to fail upward. You think I am out of my depth, Preston, I say, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. You think I am just an angry dropout who does not understand the complexities of the corporate market. I reach down to the heavy leather briefcase Taven placed on the floor right next to my chair. I pull it up and set it squarely on the mahogany dining table, pushing aside a platter of roasted duck to make room. The heavy brass clasps snap open with a sharp metallic crack, making Beatrice jump in her seat. I reach inside and pull out a thick dossier. Stamped across the front cover in bold red ink is the word confidential, followed by the official seal of my corporate firm. I toss the heavy stack of documents onto the table. It slides forward across the polished wood and stops right at Preston's fingertips. I understand high-level finance perfectly, Preston, I say, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the table. Which is exactly why my forensic auditing firm just confirmed your startup officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy this morning. Preston stands frozen by the fireplace, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. All his arrogant corporate buzzwords have completely evaporated, leaving nothing but a terrified, exposed fraud. I do not even look at him anymore. I reach across the mahogany table, pressing my manicured fingers against the thick, red-stamped dossier, and slide it directly in front of my father. The heavy stack of paper glides over the polished wood and stops right against Vernon's empty crystal water glass. Open it, Vernon, I command, my voice echoing with absolute unyielding authority. Vernon stares at the dossier as if it is a live explosive. His hands are trembling so violently he cannot even bring himself to touch the cover. The reality of his impending financial ruin is radiating off the man, but his ego is still desperately trying to reject the truth. Beatrice immediately lunges forward from the velvet sofa, her silk dress rustling aggressively. She slaps her hand down on top of the dossier, trying to physically shield Vernon from the facts. Do not look at that garbage, Vernon, she shrieks, her voice reaching a frantic, hysterical pitch. She printed this nonsense off the internet just to ruin our night. She is a jealous, bitter woman trying to destroy her brother's reputation because she has nothing going for her. Preston is a genius. I went to an elite university. He knows exactly what he is doing. I lean forward, resting my elbows on the table, and lock eyes with the woman who spent my entire childhood telling me I was not good enough. This is a federally certified forensic audit. Beatrice, I say, slowly enunciating every single syllable so she cannot possibly misunderstand me. My firm utilized advanced blockchain tracking and international banking subpoenas to trace every single dime your brilliant son-in-law has touched for the last 36 months. He has 0 employees. He has 0 patents. He has absolutely 0 proprietary code. Your precious Silicon Valley genius does not even know how to write a basic security script. I look back at Vernon pointing sharply at the dossier pinned under Beatrice's shaking hand. Move her hand, Vernon, and read the highlighted sections. Read exactly where your $400,000 went. Vernon swallows hard. He gently but firmly pushes Beatrice's hand away, ignoring her dramatic gasp of betrayal. He flips open the heavy cover of the dossier. The very first page is a comprehensive financial summary graph, printed in stark, undeniable high-definition color. Vernon traces his finger down the page, his eyes widening in pure horror as he reads the itemized list of depleted accounts and overseas wire transfers. Preston finally finds his voice, stepping away from the mantel in a desperate, pathetic attempt at damage control. "Vernon, you have to listen to me," Preston stammers, holding his hands up defensively. "It was a temporary bridge loan. I had to leverage offshore liquid assets to minimize our tax liability for the upcoming seed round. The market shifted unexpectedly, and I had to pivot the capital. It is standard operating procedure for a disruptive tech launch. I was protecting your investment. You wired $250,000 from my parents' retirement account to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, I say, cutting through his pathetic lies with surgical precision. And within 48 hours, that exact same shell company routed those funds directly to an underground sports betting syndicate in Macau. You bet my parents' entire life savings on international horse racing, Preston. And you lost every single penny." Vernon's head snaps up. He looks at Preston, his face contorted with a mixture of crushing devastation and furious disbelief. "You gambled my money." Vernon chokes out, his voice barely a whisper. "You told me you were securing server space in Europe. You swore to me this was a guaranteed return. I trusted you with everything I had." "He lied to you, Vernon," I state, flatly refusing to offer my father even an ounce of sympathy. "And you let him do it because you were so blinded by his whiteness and his tailored suits that you never bothered to ask for a single financial statement. You handed him your life savings on a silver platter because you thought having a white tech executive in family photos would finally make the country club elites respect you. You bought into his privilege, and he robbed you blind." Beatrice covers her ears, shaking her head back and forth as if physical denial can somehow rewrite reality. "No," she wails, tears ruining her expensive makeup. "No, he is elevating this family. We are going to be wealthy. We are going to be untouchable. You are lying, Keisha. You are just a spiteful, lonely girl who wants to see us suffer." Look at the third page. Vernon. I continue, ignoring my mother's pathetic breakdown entirely. Look at the outstanding debts. Vernon turns the page, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. He does not just owe the bank, Vernon, I explain, watching the last shreds of my father's pride evaporate. He owes loan sharks. He owes dangerous people a lot of money. The only reason he wanted Grandpa Silas to sign the deed to this estate was so he could liquidate the ancestral property and pay off his gambling debts before the people he owes decided to break his legs. He was going to leave you and Beatrice homeless on the street just to save his own skin. Preston backs away, bumping into Chantel, who has been standing frozen near the spilled champagne. Vernon stands up from the table, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He lunges toward Preston, his fists clenched, but Tavon, my security chief, takes a single step forward, instantly blocking Vernon's path. "Do not touch him," Tavon warns, his deep voice rumbling with an unspoken threat. Chantel suddenly snaps out of her shock. Her perfect superficial world is crumbling to dust around her, and her immediate reaction is pure venomous projection. She steps in front of Preston, shielding the coward who just bankrupted her parents. She points a manicured finger at my face, her eyes blazing with irrational hatred. "You fabricated this!" Chantel screams, her voice cracking with unhinged fury. "You printed fake bank statements because you are obsessed with me. You have always been jealous of me and Preston. You want to be me so badly it is pathetic. You want my husband, you want my life, and you want my happiness because you are a miserable, unlovable dropout. You forged these documents to destroy my marriage because nobody will ever love you. I do not raise my voice. I do not break eye contact. I sit at the head of the table surrounded by my elite security team, holding the absolute power of truth over a room full of frauds. I let her scream until she runs out of breath. I offer her a cold, terrifying smile that makes her instantly regret opening her mouth. I didn't forge anything, Chantel, I say, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal calmness. But speaking of forged documents, let's talk about the deed you locked us in a freezing basement for. I reach for the heavy manila envelope, resting on the mahogany table, right next to Preston's shattered champagne flute. I untwist the red string closure and pull out the stack of aged, yellowing legal documents. The paper is thick, crisp, and unmistakably official, bearing the raised seal of the state of Georgia. I slam the entire stack down onto the table with a sharp crack that makes Chantel physically flinch. These are the original master deeds, I announce, letting my hand rest flat against the top page. The actual legitimate deeds to this property. Not the worthless decoy papers you tried to force Grandpa Silas to sign downstairs in the freezing dark. Vernon shakes his head, a nervous, disjointed laugh escaping his throat. He points a trembling finger at the paperwork, trying desperately to cling to the illusion of his authority. You are speaking absolute nonsense, Keisha. I bought this house. I sat at the bank and signed the closing papers. I have paid the property taxes every single year. I paid for the landscaping, the maintenance, the imported Italian marble Beatrice just had installed in the kitchen. My name is on the municipal registry. You do not own anything here. This is my house. I am the head of this family, and I will not let you march in here and spout these ridiculous lies. Grandpa Silas steps forward, moving past Tavon and the tactical team to stand directly beside my chair. The look on his face is one of absolute towering patriarchal authority, a side of him Vernon has not witnessed in decades. Silas grips his wooden cane, planting it firmly against the marble floor. For years, my parents had treated him like a senile burden, a frail old man who just took up space in their pristine suburban mansion. They dismissed him, ignored him, and ultimately abused him. But tonight the disguise is gone. He is the sharp, ruthless businessman who built an empire from nothing. You own nothing. Vernon Silas says, his voice booming with a heavy, undeniable resonance that commands the entire room. You have not owned a single brick of this house since 1985. Vernon recoils as if he has been physically struck in the chest. He stares at his father, his mouth opening and closing. What are you talking about? He whispers, his voice stripped of all its former bluster. When you married Beatrice, I saw exactly what kind of future this family was heading toward. Silas explains, his tone completely devoid of any sympathy. I saw the greed. I saw the desperate need to impress people who do not care about you. I watched her catalog the expensive china and calculate the square footage of the property before she even bothered to learn my last name. She wanted the lifestyle, but she possessed absolutely zero respect for the labor it took to build it. I knew that if I left the true wealth in your hands, you would squander it trying to buy your way into elite circles that secretly despise you. So I took precautions to protect our bloodline. Beatrice lets out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest. This is a lie, she cries, looking frantically from Silas to Vernon. Tell me it is a lie, Vernon. Tell me we still have the house. We have the country club membership. We have the gala next month. We cannot be ruined. Silas does not even look at her. He keeps his piercing gaze locked entirely on his son. I legally transferred the master deed of this estate, the ancestral land, and the majority shareholder rights of the family trust into a highly classified shadow holding company. Silas continues. You have been living in a decoy, Vernon. You are nothing but a tenant paying the upkeep on a property you never legally possessed. The visible accounts, the ones you so eagerly let Preston drain to fund his fake tech startup and his offshore gambling debts, are just runoff funds. The real generational wealth, the millions I built from the ground up, has been sitting safely behind corporate veils, multiplying untouched by your greedy hands. Vernon stumbles backward, his legs hitting the edge of his leather armchair. He collapses into it, utterly defeated. All the posturing, All the arrogant lectures about how I needed to learn my place, all the times he looked down on me for not fitting into his perfect affluent aesthetic, it all crumbles into dust. He is a man who just realized his entire life is a meticulously constructed lie. Chantel starts hyperventilating. But my trust fund, she stammers, grabbing Preston's arm. My inheritance. We were supposed to inherit the estate. You promised me, Preston. You promised me we were taking over the trust tonight. There is no trust fund for you, Chantel, I say, cutting through her panic. You spent your entire life mocking me for working hard, playing the role of the spoiled golden child, because you thought you were entitled to a fortune you never earned. You married a white con artist because you thought his perceived status would guarantee your place in high society. But your husband is broke, and your inheritance does not exist. But wait, I am not finished. I slide the top document off the stack. The paper is pristine, bright white, and heavily notarized. I pick it up and walk slowly around the table toward Beatrice. She shrinks back against the velvet sofa, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. She knows I am about to take the one thing she values above everything else, her status. I remember standing in this exact room 10 years ago. I remember Beatrice standing by this very fireplace yelling at me because I refused to marry a wealthy banker she had chosen for me. She told me I was an ugly, stubborn disappointment. She told me I would end up with nothing while Chantel got everything. She threatened to throw me out onto the street if I did not conform to her shallow, materialistic standards. I took that pain, I took that rejection, and I turned it into a $50 million empire, and now I am standing in this room as the most powerful person she will ever meet. I drop the final document right into Beatrice's lap. Read the beneficiary designation, Beatrice, I say coldly. Her trembling hands pick up the paper. Her perfectly manicured fingernails shake as she holds the document up to the light. Her eyes scan the complex legal jargon darting frantically across the page until they land on the bold black ink at the bottom. She lets out a sharp, breathless whimper, dropping the paper as if it burned her skin. She looks up at me, her expression a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Silas held the keys to the kingdom for decades, I say, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. But 10 years ago, when you threatened to kick me out onto the street because I refused to be a pawn in your pathetic social climbing games, Grandpa Silas made a final decision. He transferred the Shadow Holding Company to the only person in this family who actually respected the value of hard work. He gave it to the daughter you spent 32 years trying to destroy. I lean down, resting my hands on the armrest of the sofa, trapping Beatrice in place. I lean in close so she can hear every single syllable clearly. And as of 10 years ago, I am the sole owner of the holding company. I state the absolute finality of my words, suffocating the room. You are trespassing in my house. Beatrice stares at the signature on the deed. She touches the raised notary seal, tracing the undeniable legal proof with a trembling finger. The thick paper slips from her hands, fluttering down to the expensive Persian rug. All the air leaves her lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp. The perfectly curated reality she has paraded around Atlanta high society for 4 decades shatters into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. Her designer clothes and expensive pearl necklace suddenly look like a cheap Halloween costume. She is not the powerful matriarch of a wealthy dynasty. She is a squatter who has just been handed an eviction notice. She attempts to pivot, her survival instincts kicking in. Beatrice drops to her knees on the marble floor, crawling slightly toward my chair. Tears stream down her carefully contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup. Keisha, my sweet girl, my beautiful daughter. Beatrice cries, her voice dripping with a sickly, desperate sweetness that makes my stomach turn. She reaches out, trying to grab my hands, but I pull them back, crossing my arms over my chest. We were just trying to push you to your full potential. Everything I did out of love. You have to believe me. We are family. We have to stick together, especially now. I look down at this woman who spent my entire life making me feel like a stain on her perfect family portrait. I do not feel an ounce of pity. I feel absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical satisfaction. Love, I say, my voice ringing clear and steady across the silent dining room. You do not know the first thing about love. You love status. You love the illusion of superiority. I step out of the heavy oak chair, forcing her to look me in the eye as I tower over her. Do you remember my college graduation? I ask, my tone surgical and relentless. I graduated magna cum laude with a degree in computer science. You refused to take pictures with me because you said my natural hair looked unkempt for your elite country club friends. You told me I looked like a militant radical and that no man would ever want to provide for a woman so stubbornly independent. You told me I was an embarrassment. Beatrice shakes her head frantically, her diamond earrings catching the light from the fireplace. I was just trying to protect you from a harsh world, Keisha. I wanted you to fit in. I wanted you to have an easy life like Chantel. You wanted me to be invisible. I correct her sharply, slicing through her pathetic excuses. You took $100,000 and handed it to Preston, a man who has done nothing but disrespect this household since the day he walked in. You praised his mediocrity because his whiteness made you feel adjacent to power. You worshipped his empty corporate buzzwords while you actively ridiculed my actual intellect. You threw Chantel a wedding that cost more than a starter home, but when I needed a tiny fraction of that to buy my first secure servers, you told me I was wasting my life. You did not push me to my potential, Beatrice. You tried to bury me so deep I would never outshine your golden child. Beatrice covers her face, sobbing loudly. Her wails echo off the high ceilings. Please, Keisha, this is my home. All my friends are here. My entire life is tied to this neighborhood. You cannot throw your own mother out onto the street. What will people say? They will say you got exactly what you deserved, I reply, turning my back on her entirely. Seeing that Beatrice's emotional manipulation has completely failed, Vernon realizes he has run out of options with me. His aggressive, domineering facade completely crumbles. The man who had violently shoved me and a senior citizen down a flight of stairs into a freezing basement just hours ago is now shaking with pure terror. He knows my security team is blocking every exit. He knows his precious son-in-law is already in federal custody outside. He knows he has absolutely no leverage left. He pivots away from me and turns toward Grandpa Silas. Vernon drops to his knees on the marble floor right beside his weeping wife. It is a pathetic, desperate display from a man who spent his entire life projecting false authority. He looks up at the father he has treated like a senile burden for the past 10 years. Dad, please, Vernon begs, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. You cannot let her do this to me. I am your flesh and blood. I am your only son. You built this family for us, for our legacy. Preston manipulated us. He lied to us. I did not know the startup was fake. I did not know about the gambling debts. He tricked me. You have to help me fix this. Grandpa Silas stands tall, leaning his weight onto his wooden cane. The ambient light from the fireplace casts deep shadows across his weathered face. He looks down at Vernon, his expression devoid of any warmth, any sympathy, or any paternal instinct. There is only the ruthless, uncompromising judgment of a self-made titan who has watched his empire be disrespected for far too long. Legacy. Silas repeats the word, rolling off his tongue with heavy disgust. You dare speak to me about legacy, Vernon? I worked my hands to the bone during segregation. I built a fortune in a city that did not even want me to drink from the same water fountain. I created generational wealth so my children would never have to bow their heads to anyone. Vernon reaches out, trying to grab the hem of Silas's coat, but Silas strikes his cane hard against the floor, stopping Vernon dead in his tracks. And what did you do with that sacrifice? Silas demands, his voice rising, filling the room with an undeniable power. You took the wealth I bled for and used it to buy fake friends who laugh at you behind your back. You let your wife humiliate your brightest daughter because you were too weak to stand up to a woman whose only talent is spending money she never earned. You handed my hard-earned capital over to a smooth-talking con artist just because he looked the part of a Silicon Valley executive. You let that boy walk into my house, disrespect my legacy, and rob you blind, and you thanked him for the privilege. Vernon is openly weeping now, his chest heaving as the absolute truth of his pathetic existence is laid bare in front of the entire room. I was trying to secure our position. Dad, Vernon chokes out, grasping at straws. I wanted us to be at the top. I wanted us to be elite. I was just trying to protect the family name. You wanted to be something you are not. Silas corrects him, his tone sharp and unforgiving. You forgot who you are. You forgot where you came from. I watched you tonight. I watched you put your hands on your own daughter. I watched you shove me, your own father, into a freezing concrete box and lock the door. You were willing to let us freeze to death just to protect your fake social standing and a son-in-law who has been using you as a personal automated teller machine. The entire room is dead silent save for Vernon's ragged breathing and Beatrice's muffled sobs. Chantel sits frozen on the velvet sofa, her eyes wide with shock, finally realizing that the endless well of money she has relied on her entire life has completely dried up. My security team stands motionless at the perimeter, silent witnesses to the total dismantling of a toxic dynasty. Silas takes a step closer to his son, his shadow falling completely over Vernon's kneeling form. The air in the room feels thick, charged with the finality of decades of deferred justice. Silas looks Vernon dead in the eye. You sold your soul for a country club membership and a son-in-law who despises you. You are no son of mine. The absolute finality of my grandfather's words hangs in the heated air of the living room. Vernon collapses forward, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with violent sobs. The patriarch who ruled this family through intimidation and conditional love is nothing but a hollow shell crying on my Persian rug. But as satisfying as Vernon's breakdown is, my focus shifts entirely to the architect of this specific disaster. Preston is standing by the shattered remains of his champagne glass. The protective shield he has enjoyed since the day he infiltrated this family has just evaporated. Vernon cannot fund his lifestyle anymore. Beatrice cannot defend his genius. He is completely exposed, and the realization hits his nervous system like a freight train. The smug, condescending facade that he wore like a tailored suit melts away completely. His face flushes a mottled, furious red, and the veins in his neck bulge against his expensive collar. He steps away from the fireplace, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. He resorts to the only tactic he has left, pure aggressive intimidation. "You think you can destroy my life and get away with it?" Preston shouts, his voice cracking with panic. "You hacked my private servers. That is a federal offense, Keisha. It is corporate espionage. My lawyers are going to bury you in litigation so deep you will never see daylight. I will sue your fake little company into the ground for defamation." I do not flinch. I do not even blink. I sit back in the heavy oak chair, crossing my arms and looking at him with absolute surgical precision. "Defamation requires a lie." "Preston," I reply, my voice perfectly steady, projecting a terrifying calm across the room. "Every single financial document in that dossier is an undeniable, verifiable fact. And as for your accusation of corporate espionage, you flatter yourself. You do not have a secure corporate infrastructure to hack. You used open-source code for your failing application, and you secured your primary offshore shell company with a password so weak my junior analysts bypassed it in 4 minutes. I did not have to hack you. You left a trail of financial incompetence a mile wide because your arrogance convinced you that no one would ever dare question your brilliance." Preston breathes heavily, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit, looking for an ally, but he finds absolutely nothing. Tavon and my security team stand like statues, blocking every possible road of escape. But I did not stop at simply auditing your pathetic excuse for a company. I continue leaning forward and resting my hands flat on the mahogany table. While you were upstairs drinking my vintage champagne and bragging about locking a 78-year-old man in a freezing basement, I was making calls on the hardwired landline you were too stupid to cut. I authorized my acquisitions department to reach out to the aggressive creditors you have been dodging for the last 6 months. Preston's breath hitches. He takes a staggering step backward, his heel crunching on the broken crystal. "What did you do?" he whispers, the aggressive bravado draining from his body instantly. "I located the underground sports betting syndicates and the offshore loan sharks you owe," I explain, watching the absolute terror take hold of his features. "They were furious, Preston. They were actively looking for you. They considered your debt highly toxic, and they were more than happy to offload it for pennies on the dollar. So I authorized a massive capital transfer from my shadow holding company." I reach into the dossier and slide one final heavy legal contract across the table. It stops right at the edge, hanging over the polished wood. "I bought your paper, Preston," I announce, the words ringing with absolute lethal finality. "I bought every single cent of your outstanding debt. You do not owe angry, dangerous men in Macau anymore. You do not owe anonymous offshore shell companies. As of 1 hour ago, my corporation owns 100% of your financial liabilities. I am your sole largest creditor. Preston looks like he is going to vomit. His knees buckle slightly, and he has to grab the stone edge of the fireplace mantel just to stay upright. No, he gasps, shaking his head in frantic denial. No, you cannot do that. That is illegal. You cannot just buy my debt. It is perfectly legal in the corporate sector, I assure him, offering a cold, unyielding smile. It is called aggressive asset acquisition. You should know all about it since you love throwing around venture capital buzzwords. You owe me $4,250,000, Preston. And as your sole creditor, I am calling the debt in. I require immediate repayment in full tonight. I do not have it, he screams, his voice hitting a hysterical pitch. You know I do not have it. The startup is bankrupt. The accounts are drained. I am completely broke. Chantel, who has been sitting frozen on the velvet sofa, suddenly snaps. The realization that her wealthy tech executive husband is actually a penniless criminal in massive debt to the sister she despises shatters her fragile reality. She leaps up from the couch and launches herself at Preston. She beats her fists against his chest, screaming at the top of her lungs. You lied to me, Chantel shrieks, her face contorted with rage. You told me we were rich. You told me we were going to the top. You spent my father's money and now we have nothing. I married you because you were supposed to be elite. You are a fraud. You ruined my life. Preston roughly shoves Chantel away, sending her stumbling back onto the sofa. Shut up, he snarls, turning his furious, desperate eyes back to me. You think you have won, Keisha. You think you trapped me. But you just wasted your money. I will file for personal bankruptcy tomorrow morning. I will liquidate everything, and you will not see a single dime of that $4 million. You bought worthless paper. I slowly stand up from the head of the table. I smooth down the front of my blazer, radiating an aura of total inescapable power. I did not buy your debt to get my money back, Preston. I say, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that forces everyone in the room to hold their breath. I bought your debt so I could own your consequences. I bought your debt to ensure you can never secure a loan, open a bank account, or start a fraudulent company ever again. Financial ruin is just the appetizer tonight. Preston stares at me, his chest heaving, his mind desperately trying to comprehend the sheer scale of the trap closing around him. You see, bankruptcy might protect you from civil collection. I continue, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. But bankruptcy does not protect you from criminal charges. What criminal charges? Preston scoffs, but the fear in his eyes betrays his false bravado. White-collar financial crimes take years to prosecute. You cannot touch me tonight. I am not talking about the money you stole from my parents, I clarify, tilting my head slightly. I am talking about what you did an hour ago. I am talking about you and Vernon physically assaulting a vulnerable senior citizen. I am talking about you dragging us down a flight of stairs, throwing us into an unheated concrete box, and locking a heavy steel deadbolt from the outside while the temperature dropped below freezing. Preston's face goes completely slack. In the state of Georgia, that is not a financial dispute, I explain coldly. That is false imprisonment. That is kidnapping. That is felony elder abuse and extortion. You tried to freeze us to death to force a signature on a property deed. You have no proof. Preston stammers, taking another step back until his shoulders hit the stone fireplace. It is your word against ours. Vernon and Beatrice will back me up. They will say you went down there willingly. I laugh, a harsh, sharp sound that cuts through his desperate delusion. You really thought a woman who runs a $50 million cybersecurity empire would not have redundant hardwired surveillance cameras hidden in every single hallway of her own home, I ask. You thought I would leave my property unprotected. I look at Tavin, who stands like a sentinel by the door. Tavin already pulled the pristine high-definition footage from the secure servers I announced, delivering the absolute fatal blow. He compiled the video of you and Vernon dragging us down the stairs. He compiled the audio of you locking the deadbolt and threatening us through the air vents. And because you locked the legal owner of this property and a senior citizen in a freezing basement, my security team already sent the interior surveillance footage directly to the Fulton County District Attorney. Preston's entire body shudders as the absolute inescapable reality of his situation crushes him. You owe me $4 million, Preston. I say, my voice echoing through the silent, devastated room. And you are going to spend a very long time in a federal penitentiary thinking about how you should have never underestimated a black woman. Right on cue, piercing the cold quiet of the winter night, the faint wail of police sirens begins to echo in the distance. The sound grows louder and louder, sweeping through the affluent neighborhood, screaming toward the gates of my estate. The reckoning has officially arrived. The piercing shriek of police sirens shatters the quiet exclusivity of the neighborhood. The strobe of red and blue emergency lights pulses violently through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the shocked faces of my family in harsh, flashing colors. The heavy mahogany front doors are shoved open before anyone can even process the sound. 6 Atlanta Police Department officers storm into the grand foyer, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They do not look confused or hesitant. Tavin made sure the Fulton County District Attorney had the raw footage of the basement assault before the squad cars even dispatched. They know exactly what they are walking into. Tavin steps forward, immediately intercepting the lead detective. He hands over a physical encrypted flash drive containing the high-definition video and audio of Preston and Vernon dragging me and Grandpa Silas down the stairs and locking that heavy steel deadbolt. The detective nods, barely glancing at my parents before locking his eyes entirely on Preston. Preston completely snaps. The polished Silicon Valley executive routine vanishes, instantly replaced by the frantic flailing of a cornered coward. When 2 officers step toward him, pulling their handcuffs from their belts, Preston actually tries to run. He shoves past Chantel, nearly knocking her to the marble floor, and makes a desperate dash for the kitchen archway. My security operatives do not even have to move. The police tackle him hard against the expensive imported wallpaper Beatrice loves so much. "Get your hands off me!" Preston screams, his voice cracking as the officers force his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoes through the dining room. "You have no right to do this. I am a tech executive. I know the mayor. These people are lying. This is a setup." The detective reads him his rights in a bored, monotone voice, completely unbothered by Preston's entitled tantrum. Preston thrashes against the officers, twisting his neck to glare at me with pure, unhinged hatred. "You angry, bitter dropout." He spits the racial hostility he kept hidden for 3 years, finally bleeding out for everyone to hear. "You think you can lock me up? I will ruin you. I will take every cent you have. You do not even have enough sense to buy a phone call from the county jail." "Preston," I say, my voice slicing through his frantic screaming. "My corporation owns your debt. My security team provided the evidence. Enjoy federal prison." The officers drag him out, dragging his expensive designer loafers across the hardwood floors. Chantel lets out a guttural, devastating shriek as she watches her entire social standing getting hauled out the front door in handcuffs. She scrambles to her feet, her designer silk gown stained dark with spilled vintage champagne. She runs toward the foyer but stops dead when a police officer puts up a firm hand telling her to step back. Chantel spins around to face me, her chest heaving. "What am I supposed to do?" she wails, tears ruining her professional makeup. "He is my husband, Keisha. How am I supposed to pay for my life? How am I supposed to survive?" "You could try getting a job, Chantel," I reply, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed. "You spent the last decade mocking my career and spending Vernon's retirement money on luxury handbags. Now you get to join the real world. Welcome to the working class." The police clear the foyer, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. I turn my attention to Beatrice and Vernon. They are both staring at the empty space where Preston just stood, completely paralyzed by the reality of their collapse. The country club luncheons, the elite galas, the bragging rights they sacrificed their own daughter for, it is all entirely gone. I look at my watch. The luminescent dial glows brightly against my dark skin. "You have exactly 10 minutes, I announce, my voice ringing with total, absolute authority. 10 minutes for what? Vernon asks, his voice barely a hollow croak. 10 minutes to pack 1 standard-size suitcase each, I explain, looking directly into his terrified eyes. "You are trespassing on my property. You are lucky I am not having the police arrest you for your role in the basement assault, Vernon. But you are leaving tonight, right now. 1 suitcase. Anything that does not fit in that bag stays here. It belongs to the estate, which means it belongs to me." Beatrice gasps, clutching her pearl necklace as if I am physically ripping it from her throat. "You cannot do this, Keisha," she cries, dropping to her knees again. "Please. My clothes, my jewelry, the artwork. We collected those pieces for 30 years. You cannot just throw your mother out into the winter night with nothing. Where are we supposed to go? You can go exactly where you tried to send me, when you told me I was an ugly disappointment who would never amount to anything." I reply, stepping closer to her kneeling form. "You can figure it out. And as for your jewelry and your designer clothes, you bought those using funds you drained from the visible accounts. You bought those with money pressed and embezzled. None of it legally belongs to you. Pack your basics, Beatrice. 10 minutes. I look up at Taven, escort them upstairs. If they try to stuff a single piece of jewelry or any luxury items into their bags, confiscate them. If they refuse to leave the premises when the timer runs out, call the police back and have them arrested for criminal trespassing. Taven nods, signaling his men. Two massive tactical operators step forward, gesturing toward the grand staircase. Move, the operative commands, his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Watching them walk up those stairs is a profoundly poetic moment. Vernon moves like a man walking to his own execution. His shoulders are slumped, his head is bowed, and his legs can barely carry his weight. Beatrice is sobbing hysterically, leaning against the mahogany banister for support. Chantel follows them, shivering in her ruined designer gown, clutching her arms around herself as the reality of her sudden poverty sinks in. Grandpa Silas stands beside me, leaning comfortably on his wooden cane. We listen to the frantic, muffled sounds of drawers opening and closing upstairs. We listen to Beatrice wailing as the security team forces her to leave behind her mink coats and her Cartier watches. They are stripping away the very armor she used to make me feel small. Exactly 9 minutes and 45 seconds later, they descend the staircase. It is a pathetic, pathetic sight. Vernon is dragging a scuffed, rolling suitcase, the wheels clicking loudly against the marble foyer. Beatrice is clutching a small duffel bag, her face stained with black mascara, her perfectly coiffed hair a mess. Chantel is carrying a canvas tote, looking absolutely terrified of a world she has never had to navigate without a safety net. Taven opens the heavy mahogany front doors. A brutal gust of freezing wind sweeps into the warm, grand foyer. It is the exact same biting, icy wind that sliced through my blazer when they locked me in the concrete basement. The temperature outside is hovering near 20 degrees. Beatrice stops at the threshold, shivering violently as the freezing air hits her face. She turns back to me one final time. Her eyes are desperate, begging for a sliver of the daughter she spent 32 years trying to destroy. "Keisha, please," Beatrice wails, her teeth actually chattering from the sudden cold. "It is freezing out there. We do not have a car. The police took Preston's vehicle. We do not have anywhere to sleep. You cannot lock us out in the cold. We are your family." I walk slowly towards the doorway, stopping just short of the freezing wind. I stand arm in arm with Grandpa Silas, feeling the solid, comforting warmth of the only man who ever truly protected me. I look Beatrice up and down, taking in her shivering frame, her ruined makeup, and the absolute devastation of her status-obsessed ego. "You should have thought about the cold before you locked us in the basement," I say, my voice dead flat, devoid of any pity or hesitation. "Goodbye, Beatrice." Taven steps forward, forcing them out onto the freezing stone porch. Vernon grabs Chantel's arm, pulling her away from the house as the tactical operators step back inside. Beatrice lets out one final gut-wrenching sob, standing on the frost-covered bricks, wrapping her arms around her thin coat. I look at Grandpa Silas. He gives me a slow, proud nod. I reach out and grab the heavy brass handles of the double doors. I pull them shut with a massive resounding crash that echoes through the empty foyer. I turn the heavy deadbolt, feeling the mechanical click lock into place. The sound seals them out in the freezing dark, separating them forever from the life they thought they owned. The echo of that heavy deadbolt sliding into place stayed with me for a long time. It was not just the sound of brass locking into a steel frame. It was the sound of a generational curse finally being broken. It was the definitive end of 32 years of conditional love, emotional manipulation, and toxic expectations. 6 months later, that harsh metallic click has been completely replaced by the quiet, steady hum of progress. I am standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corporate headquarters, looking out over the sprawling skyline of downtown Atlanta. The morning sun reflects off the surrounding skyscrapers, casting brilliant streaks of light across my executive office. I take a deep breath of the crisp air conditioning, smoothing the lapels of my custom-tailored suit. I am no longer the scapegoat, shrinking in the corner of a formal dining room, desperate for a scrap of validation from people who never wanted to understand me. I am the apex predator of my industry, standing at the absolute summit of an empire I built with my own two hands. The fallout from that freezing Christmas night was swift, surgical, and absolutely merciless. Preston found out exactly how the real world operates when you cannot hide behind a veneer of corporate jargon and unearned privilege. The Fulton County District Attorney did not offer him a polite corporate bailout or a slap on the wrist. Armed with the irrefutable high-definition surveillance footage from the basement and the devastating forensic audit, my firm provided the federal prosecutors dismantled him completely. I actually attended his sentencing hearing sitting in the back row with perfect posture. I watched Preston attempt to leverage his charm one last time, wearing an ill-fitting court-appointed suit, weeping about the intense pressure of the startup ecosystem. The judge was utterly unmoved. When the audio of him locking a senior citizen in a concrete box was played in open court, the entire room fell dead silent. Preston was sentenced to 20 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, embezzlement, and elder endangerment. The man who tried to lecture me about disruptive synergy and vertical integration is currently making 30 cents an hour, pressing license plates and staring at cinderblock walls. Chantel had a much harder landing than she ever could have anticipated. When the frozen assets were officially seized by the government and the reality of her total insolvency, set in her pristine, sheltered world, shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. The woman who once mocked me for fixing routers and flaunted her designer gowns, paid for by my father's dwindling savings, is now clocking in for 40-hour weeks at a discount retail store in a dying suburban mall. She wears a stiff polyester uniform instead of imported silk. I heard through my security chief, Avon, that she recently had a public breakdown at the cash register when a customer she used to socialize with at the country club handed her an expired coupon. She is learning the agonizing, relentless lesson that the people who only love you for your proximity to wealth will abandon you the exact second the well runs dry. But the most poetic, devastating justice was reserved for Vernon and Beatrice. For a couple whose entire existence was predicated on the validation of the affluent Atlanta elite, anonymity was a fate far worse than death. They are currently renting a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city, far away from the manicured lawns, the gated driveways, and the private security patrols they once claimed to rule. The country club formally revoked their membership, citing the public embarrassment of the massive fraud scandal. They do not go out to upscale restaurants anymore. They do not host extravagant dinner parties. They live in absolute, suffocating isolation, paralyzed by the shame of their own monumental failure. The thin walls of their cheap apartment force them to listen to the lives of their neighbors, a constant grating reminder of the luxury they threw away. They traded their only loyal, brilliant daughter for a fleeting illusion of prestige and a con artist who despised them, and it left them with absolutely nothing but each other. The heavy frosted glass doors of my office swing open smoothly, interrupting my thoughts. I turn away from the panoramic view of the city, and a genuine warm smile immediately spreads across my face. Grandpa Silas walks into the room. He is not using his wooden cane. The hunched, frail posture he weaponized as a brilliant disguise for a decade is entirely gone. He is walking tall, his shoulders squared and his head held high. He is wearing a sharp, custom-tailored navy blue suit, his silver hair perfectly trimmed and his eyes bright with a sharp, vital energy. He moved into the master suite of my luxury penthouse the very morning after the eviction. He spends his days overseeing his newly established philanthropic investments, directing capital to young Black women in the technology sector. He spends his evenings enjoying private chef-prepared meals on a massive balcony overlooking the city skyline. He is finally living like the king he truly is, free from the exhausting burden of pretending to be weak. "You are in early today," Keisha Silas says, his deep, rich voice filling the expansive office. He walks over to the sleek, wet bar tucked into the corner of the room and inspects the row of crystal decanters. "There is always an empire to manage, Grandpa," I reply, walking over to join him. "And I like the quiet before the rest of the building wakes up." Silas chuckles, pouring a small measure of 20-year-old reserved bourbon into two heavy crystal tumblers. He hands one to me, his eyes crinkling at the corners with immense pride. He does not say a word about Vernon or Beatrice. He does not mention Chantel or the miserable cold life they built for themselves. We do not need to waste our breath on the people we left behind in the dark. The silence between us is a victory march. Silas raises his glass, catching the morning sunlight in the amber liquid. "To the architect of the future," he says, his voice thick with profound respect. "To the woman who knew how to wait in the shadows until it was time to strike." I raise my glass, meeting his proud gaze. "To the man who handed me the blueprints," I reply softly. We clink our glasses together, the clear, sharp ring of the crystal echoing beautifully through the sunlit office. I take a slow sip, feeling the smooth heat of the bourbon settle deep in my chest. I spent my entire life being told I was a disappointment because I refused to shrink myself to fit into their shallow, restrictive molds. I was told my natural hair was unprofessional, my ambition was intimidating, and my independence was a liability. But looking out over the sprawling city, I conquered, standing right beside the only family member who ever recognized my brilliance. I know the absolute, undeniable truth. Power is not loud. Real power does not need to boast at a formal dining table. It does not need to hide behind corporate buzzwords or demand unearned respect through cruelty and manipulation. Loyalty is not a birthright you can extort from your children just because you share a last name. It is a sacred bond earned in the dark when no one else is watching. They thought I was the scapegoat. They thought I was the punchline to their cruel jokes. They had absolutely no idea they were simply the stepping stones I used to build my throne. And the sweetest, most devastating revenge of all is building an untouchable empire in total absolute silence and letting your enemies drown in the deafening noise of their own destruction. The greatest lesson I learned from that freezing Christmas night is that true power does not need to announce itself. While my family was busy tearing me down to inflate their own fragile egos, I used their underestimation as my absolute greatest shield. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you, and sometimes the only way to protect your peace is to permanently lock the door on the people who refuse to respect your boundaries. Family is not determined by blood or shared last names. It is defined by who stands beside you in the dark. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace and build your own empire? Share your story in the comments below, and do not forget to hit like and subscribe for more stories about reclaiming your power and standing your ground.